Hello, I'm Dr. Kwasu David Tembo, and I'm joined today on what we're calling Literature Plus by Ines. Ines currently teaches the novel in creative writing as well as a half module on the graphic novel, which I believe is new. And it'll be interesting to talk about that in a little bit as well. But Ines, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm so glad that we actually found the time to do this. There's so many interesting things I want to talk to you about in and around the idea or concept or experience of failure. I think it's something that we as academics have to just go through. It's something that we encounter not just in our praxis, but in life more generally. And it's interesting to see how it is that other people meet this constraint or challenge when it comes to their work, but just how you feel about failure more generally. So, I mean, I can just put the question to you that generally, and then maybe pick up some specifics as we go along. Yeah. So how do you feel about failure? What do you think about it?
I love failure. I live for failure. I wake up in the mornings and I think, you know what would be good to do today? To fail at something. No, but actually I think, from the point of view of being an academic, but more so of being an artist and a writer, man, failure is just like...
Sure.
You just have to get accustomed to it, and I would go as far as to say that fear of failure can be so dangerous as to, because, I think it's very common for artists to be really scared of rejection, and rejection to be especially crushing. Now, for me, when I think about my creative writing, that's my, when I receive rejection on that, or when I fail at that, those are my most crushing rejections ever,
Yeah.
Whereas with the academic stuff, I tend to see it in a different way. I mean, of course, it also hurts. But I would say that all the pain of the rejections is worth it, and it's part of the process. And it took me a long while to understand that. And before, I just prefer not to put myself out there. Like, it took me so many years to actually start sending my work out to publishers. Right. Just because I was like, I just cannot cope
with the potential or inevitable rejection.
Exactly. And right. To me that's the worst. Now I see that's the worst. So
yeah, because that's such an interesting way of phrasing it, because from a praxeological standpoint, this fear of failure, fear of rejection is debilitating. It prevents you, it's preventative from putting your work out there. And in so many ways it kind of stifles the very same voice that you've tried to cultivate.
Exactly, yeah.
But where do you think this fear comes from in a lot of people? Like, what is it referring to? I always wonder about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've done my fair research on failure and rejections, especially as I started teaching creative writing, because obviously that's something that comes up a lot in the workshop and in the class. When I ask people, do you send your stuff out? They say no. Reason number one normally is fear of rejection. Or I hear students saying, I sent this short story to this journal, they rejected it. Now I think this story is shit, never gonna, use it again for anything else. And that breaks my heart, because I'm like, geez, no, that's not how it works. To get a short story published, you normally have to send it to like lots of different places,
Right.
It would just be like so bad for your career and for you as a writer to just take one rejection and for that to be a judgment on your art and or on that particular piece, just to trust just that particular rejection, you know what I mean?
I understand, like as a singular kind of limit.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting that you say, because maybe it's also a question of fear of failure not necessarily being a kind of diminishment of the ego to some degree or other, but maybe also predicated on an erroneous imaginary.
Yeah.
As if to suggest that people have in their mind an idea of what that trajectory should look like, from drafting to creation to publication. And I think people maybe erroneously imagine it to be way more narrow or way quicker than it actually is. Yeah. What's actually involved in the task of publication or of writing or getting your voice heard, as it were. That it's arduous and it's iterative. It takes so many different attempts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that no matter where you are at in your career, you're still facing rejection.
Right, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, because for some, I have experience publishing books. So for some people, it may be just like, oh, you've published books, you're fine now. And it's like, no. Every single book I put out, every single, I still kind of like have to go through the process again.
Sure, yeah.
I think unless you are a Stephen King level, and probably even for a Stephen King, maybe sometimes he goes to his publisher with a crazy idea and the publisher is like, no, dude.
Yeah.
Actually, no.
Which is, so I think that's helpful, because maybe a part of the way of assuaging some of this fear of failure is to kind of give people as much information as about the process as possible. To say to them, listen, this is what the shape, the contours of the process look like. I mean, they'll be different depending on the task, depending on where it is that you're trying to publish, but you should be cognizant of the fact that you're not going to just get it right at the first go.
No.
And different people and different publishers, different people who are analyzing, reviewing, offering suggestions, critiquing your work might have a completely different vantage and different experience of that particular text than you do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, insofar as your students are concerned, because you did mention workshopping,
Yeah.
how is it that you go about presenting failure to your students? And what is it that you think that they should really keep in mind when it is that they themselves fail?
That's really interesting. So, I mean, when I'm thinking about failure in creative work, I think of rejection, right? Of
Sure.
because, I mean, you know, especially from the point of view of a writer, and I'm also an illustrator,
Yeah.
but I think from the point of view of a writer, it's such a lonely thing to do. And some, you know, you can write a story, but it's not until the story is published somewhere that it feels like it's real.
Right.
If that makes sense, versus when I paint, if I make an illustration, once I have the illustration, even if it's just my eyes are seeing it, I already feel a sense of accomplishment.
That it's there.
It's just
real
there, you know,
fire.
it
It's real.
exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I just want to kind of like validate people's feelings of, you know, failure when they get a piece rejected by a publisher, because for writing, I mean, it is important to get the stuff out. That's what most of us write.
Sure.
But I mean, it is part of the process, and I think to me is the difficult thing about that rejection is to kind of like distinguish what it means. So because if you get a rejection on a piece, say on a short story, right?
Sure.
It could be two things. It could be that the story still needs work, or the novel, or the idea.
Right.
You know, which it can happen. I mean, and that's perfectly fine. And sometimes, you know, you can't really say that's the case when the person at the other side, you know, takes the time to actually give you some feedback, especially constructive feedback. Now, in my experience, publishers, editors are incredibly busy.
Of course.
So normally you just receive a blanket email of a sorry, but no thank you.
Quite generic or brief.
Exactly. But if they're taking the time to say, you know, there were things I liked, but I thought you could improve on pace, you could improve on character. If they're taking the time to write that, I would say pay attention to that, because that's not usual and probably is well-intentioned. So I would say if that's the case, probably means the piece needs a bit more work, and then you can keep working on it and then send it out. But other times, the piece is just right as it is, and then it may be that, you know, it may be that they're already publishing something similar.
Right.
It may be that what you are doing is so innovative, so original, that you're just not ready for that.
Right.
And that happens. I mean, I talk a lot of time with like other writer friends, and so many times they've been told that their stories are too niche, or, you know, their stories wouldn't be relatable enough, or they're really cool and original, but the publishers don't think they can sell them.
There's no readership that they can imagine anyway.
Yeah, and that's kind of like a bullshit reason in a way, and that makes me
Sure.
really angry. And that's like, because many times it can be just that, that the publisher is not, I don't know, like, I suppose he's not willing to take the risk, which is really, can be really sad.
Sure.
And in that case, it's not your fault, I suppose, as the writer, but it's the responsibility of the literary world and the gatekeepers. And sometimes then you should just perhaps self-publish it or create your own publishing house.
Sure. I think that's so helpful to hear for a lot of students, to know full well the parameters in which their work is received.
Yeah.
How, when, what constraints your potential publishers are working against themselves. What constraints of imagination that they might have themselves, insofar as not being able to really situate or compartmentalize what it is that you've presented. Specifically, if it is pushing at this kind of generic or border transgression that in and of itself is trying to sort of make something new or make something impossible possible through its, you know, experimentation with form or style or what have you. And I like what you're saying in this what reads to me is very encouraging to say, you know, first, it requires you to, on the one hand, set aside your ego and that initial pain, which can be very visceral and debilitating to a lot of people. It can stifle or completely destroy their endeavor.
Yeah.
But if you manage to circumvent that, then you should really pause, to take the time to really read what's being said and read between the lines, which can be a skill that you might need experience to learn to discover full well whether or not there's an issue or shortcoming with the material, or whether or not it's the kind of milieu beyond it that requires some renegotiation in some way. But what's interesting about that is that you're basically suggesting that people should be not just writing but reading on a variety of different strata as their work is like put out there.
Yeah.
It's an interesting skill. I mean, in your experience as a writer, has that come to you easily, would you say? Or did it take a long while? Or are you still sort of refining it as you go now?
Yeah, no, I mean, God, it's not easy. And I have a fear of rejection, like a very visceral fear. 100%. I've cried. Quite honestly, with some of the rejections I've got. And they've made me feel miserable for days, weeks, sometimes even months. I mean, I'm not going to lie. And some are more painful than others. I think the more you get rejected, the less it hurts in a way.
Sure.
So I think it's encouraging. Like, I feel like, say, 10 years ago, the same kind of rejection would completely would destroy me.
Sure.
And maybe today is just like more of for some things. But there's always a painful one now and again when you're like, man.
Especially if you really want it.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a thing that might be important to bring into view is that it's not illegitimate or somehow invalid to feel that pain.
No.
Especially because I do think a lot of our students are so passionate, are so self-identified as creators and readers of text that it's very difficult to demarcate where it is at the page end and they begin.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much of themselves in the work, in what it is that they produce, which is ultimately critiqued and marked and graded in some respect. So it's difficult not to be able to distinguish a commentary on the text versus a commentary on the author, on their person. But it is a skill, I think. It is a technique that is easier to apply to your own work and your own self-awareness and self-apperception as a writer as you continue to practice. So I'm assuming that you might recommend that the goal is to keep going.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And there is a wonderful article, I think it's published by LeadHub.
Yeah.
I think the one called 'Aim for 100 Rejections' or something similar. And it's basically a writer talking about her friend. And she has this writer friend who, for some reason, seems to always be getting things like writing residencies, fellowships, opportunities to kind of publish her writing. And she's like, what's her trick? And she asks her, and I have a friend like that, by the way. I have my dear friend, Yvonne Battle-Felton. She's also a writer. She also teaches, and she's the same. She's always getting things. and you ask these people, and you're like, how? And they're like, they literally apply to everything they see.
Sure.
Because so many times, it's so easy to just see something and then just think, nah, I'm never going to get it.
Right, it's beyond me.
It's beyond me, or my project is not exactly like this, or it's not an exact fit, or... and these people just literally apply to everything. And then if you apply to everything, and in the case of the article, the author tries to apply to 100 things per year.
Wow.
That's, she tries to get 100 rejections. Now, by trying to get 100 rejections, you are going to get acceptances too. Because
of course,
the secret is, for publishing, I can tell you, it's a numbers game.
Totally.
It truly is.
Volume.
Yeah, it's a question of volume and it's a question of persistence. So it's not about being the best or writing the best novel ever written. It's not about that.
Right.
It's just finding that outlet that shares your vision, I suppose.
That'll ultimately overlap.
Exactly.
And you can't know that up until you really find it.
Yeah.
And the way to find that is to keep trying a variety of different avenues.
Yeah.
So stamina, courage, and I would say self-empathy. This is one word that gets bandied around a lot of late. But I do think the most radical form of it is to accept full well that you're not going to basically know what to do at any given stage. And to give yourself the leeway, and it's a word that my mom uses a lot, but the grace to be like, I kind of don't know, and that's okay, but I really want this thing, and I'm going to have the courage and temerity enough to sort of at least put my name forward. And if it works, volumetrically speaking, the more I do that, the higher the chances.
Yeah. I mean, what do you do when you get a particularly painful rejection? I mean,
that's a great question in turn, and I think it's interesting to sort of like phrase that in this context, because we're approaching, I suppose, publication and writing from two different subdisciplines, if you will. Creative work, for example, I mean, it's been so minimal what I've put out. And a not small portion of the feedback that I get, I don't even look at, you know?
Yeah.
I often forget that I've even put my name out there.
Right.
But when it comes to academic publishing, I know full well that as well, there's similarities in the sense that it is volumetric. Sometimes you get, what I find the most difficult in my experience has been, is sometimes you get editors and they're reviewers who don't really give you much to work with. Because for me, it's never it's never a question of not having the will or the intention to optimize the piece if there's areas and respects that it could be improved. I would like the best possible representation of my thought associated to my name that other people will read. That I could say, no, okay, I left it all on the page, and what's there's true. And if you find contention, or if you take umbrage and you find, discrepancies, we can joust over those in good conscience, not to kick myself over the fact that like I really phoned it in, or I kind of undersold it. I didn't do it to the best of my abilities. And sometimes the best of your abilities requires, often as it does, other people to comment on any representation thereof. And sometimes when you get reviewers and editorial assistants and so on giving you, as you said earlier, very brief or very generic feedback, but saying that like, no, this piece can't be published. My question then is like, why?
Why, yeah.
And not in a defensive stance or from a defensive posture, but really from this intention to optimize. Just give me something to work with. So I find that to be challenging, not necessarily the rejection itself. And I know always, more often than not, when I do submit a piece, I know I try to be as honest with myself as possible to say, if they do want to go for this, there's going to be a lot of revisions. There's going to be work to be done in order to bring it up to standard. Sure. And I'm willing to do that, knowing the fact that it's most likely something that I will have to do. But there are other times in which those two things fall afoul of one another. And I ask myself, okay, well, on what grounds are you saying that at this point in time you don't think it's ready? And if you receive feedback that's describes such a paucity of reading, or sometimes where you get the sense that people aren't really reading your work closely because they themselves are under pressure, that they have to turn out a variety of different reviews at speed and at volume, that they're not going to give you their full eye, as it were. They're kind of looking at your piece out the corner of their eye. And you're like, okay, now I'm going to have to joust over this piece off the page. Now we're having an argument about our readerships as opposed to what we're reading. And I find that distracting because it just adds to the amount of time it takes. But for me personally, I think after my PhD, speaking of crying, I think at that point in time, I became very comfortable with rejection. And maybe it's just a temperament thing, or maybe it's an aspect of my character that I don't mind failing, because I think I've failed like my whole life in so many respects, socially, as an academic and so on and so forth. There's so many ways that my younger imaginings and the reality of who I am and what I've done do not overlap. But it doesn't bring me distress by virtue of the fact that, a lot of my own philosophical readings, people like Martin Heidegger and other people talking about error as an ethic, that you can only really see things for what they are and what's possible when they fail, in a way that your imagination cannot absolve or in so many ways redeem, and in a way obfuscate, your own imagination of yourself or what you are and what you want to be or want to achieve, versus what it is that you actually have at your disposal to do. And I find it such a shame when people have this imagination as the be-all and end-all of what it is that they can and cannot be, and refuse to really take stock, materially speaking, of what it is that they are in that present moment. You kind of lose sight of yourself. You're kind of blind to yourself. And I think rejection helps. It can really shock you out of that kind of complicity or that kind of imaginary. It can. Not always, but yeah. So that's what I would say for me. And everybody's path through and with rejection is different. But I really like what sounds to me a very positive approach, and a realistic one at that.
It's been liberating, to be fair. Especially to kind of be it's a part of the artistic journey. Like, if you want to take on this journey, you need to have that too. It's part of the package. Sure. And once you accept that, you are like, and just to share a positive story of failure, that then it wasn't failure. Actually, the novel I wrote for my PhD.
Yes.
Actually, while I was studying at Lancaster, because I did my PhD at Lancaster University. So what happens in a PhD when you write a novel is that you are encouraged to experiment a lot.
Right, exactly.
Because a PhD, by definition, is original contribution to knowledge. So you are pushed towards that, has to be original. Sure. It has to add something new to the genres. That's the main thing. So when you are a writer and you publish, you don't necessarily always have to be the original.
Truly, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like
exactly.
there's a lot of great writing out there that's doing great things in genre that people absolutely love and adore, and it's not really original.
Precisely.
But it's very successful.
An important work.
An important
in its own
work.
Way.
Yeah. But that's not the case of the PhD. So I ended up writing this truly weird experimental book, and I had a lot of fun writing that book. But you know, it had a section narrated from the point of view of a cow.
Right.
And that was at the same time this kind of like found medieval manuscript. Another section was like kind of like English blended with Spanish, a bit like A Clockwork Orange.
Right.
You know, by Anthony Burgess.
Yes.
But that kind of like uses like those random words here and there from a different language.
Right.
So it's quite demanding on the reader, I suppose.
Sure, of course, right.
And then, so I finished that in the PhD, had a lot of fun with that, passed my PhD with that, so yay.
Yes, yeah.
In a way, that was a success. But then when I was trying to publish it, oh my God, it was one failure after the other.
Sure.
It was so incredibly hard because even though I was really proud of that work, I was approaching all these publishers and I was getting lots of really frustrating emails saying, you know, I love the work, I love the writing, but dude, I cannot sell this.
Sure.
Like,
yeah, there's no, I don't know what market this can
exactly,
satisfy.
like,
Right.
I'm just not sure I can sell this, so it has to
Sure.
be a pass. I had that from agents as well. Like, I had an agent, the novel got shortlisted for a prize, and an agent contacted me giving me like wonderful feedback,
Sure.
which was so encouraging. But then he was like, actually, I cannot take you in because, again, like, I need to make money, and I don't think this will make money. So I finished that novel in 2019, and it took me around 4 years to actually find a publisher.
Right.
So man, that was hard, and I just literally I just kept emailing people, connecting with people, and it was rejection. It got to a point where I was like, maybe I never publish this, or maybe, you know, I get more established in my writing career by a different book,
Right.
and then the publisher comes back and it's like, do you have anything else? Which has happened to a lot of writers.
Sure, that's
before,
true. That's true.
You know, and then one day I just literally got an email from another publisher, because I tend to submit in rounds. So I would nominate one day a week, like, I don't know, Friday, for example, and for a couple of hours, I will just be sending stuff out.
Right, exactly.
And then I forget. I mean, I keep track of it,
Sure.
but, you know. And then one day I get this email from this publisher, and they're like, is the book still available? Because we want it. And I swear to you, I almost delete that email, and because I thought it was a rejection.
Right,
because I was so used to it.
Exactly.
Sure. And then I was like, no, Ines, wait. And I had to read it again, and I was like, they want it. And I was so surprised. And it turns out it was this little brilliant publisher, Blackwater Press.
Yeah.
So this is something I would recommend to you writers who are working on something, you know, particularly experimental, literary fiction, etc. Indie publishers normally are the way to go.
Right.
Especially if you are not very well established. And it turns out the editor who picked my book, she speaks Spanish too.
There you are.
So she's English, but she speaks Spanish, has a lot of interest in Spanish culture. The book has a lot to do with Spain. And then she was just the best editor for my work because it had bits of Spanish in the work, and she was truly correcting my Spanish because she was better in Spanish than I was. Quite frankly, I remember some of her comments were like, I know you're a native speaker, so I feel really awkward saying this, but I think this is wrong. And I was like, no, you are completely right. It's wrong. Thank you so much. So, like, failure, but then also by sheer stubbornness,
persistence, courage, stamina. I mean, I think these things all, and like time management as well, which, I mean, these skills are often gazetted, and I think a lot of students kind of breeze out because they think they're self-evident or that they in and of themselves have no practical application. But your testimony, I think, is extremely valuable by virtue of the fact that a listener would pick up on the veracity of what you're saying and the fact that, like, I heard about time management. Oh, Ines set aside one day to, like, do the rounds.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I can manage my time and I can manage this effort in that particular way that pays dividends. And I also really like the fact that you stuck to your guns insofar as specifically sticking to an experimental approach, because I think rejection can maybe to some degree denature your own impetus, your own will. It can make you think that you have to kind of machine it and tool it in such a way that is satisfying a brief as opposed to satisfying itself in a weird way. Like this kind of fidelity the text has to itself. I mean, I'm literally speaking of these moments where you doubt that you've succeeded,
Yeah.
because you failed so often.
Yeah.
Which is a dangerous meta-narrative that can take place in your own mind to say like, no, I've had so many rejections that like, I'm just going to treat every correspondence or review as the same and not really taking the time. You have to do it like a double take. Like, wait, what?
Yeah.
I just got reviews back for this monograph on time travel that I've been working on for years. There's different circumstances, moving from Accra and so on and so forth, that got in the way of writing it in the way that I wanted to write it. And the text changed in such a way that I found extremely terrifying by virtue of the fact that I couldn't stand behind what it is that I'm good at and use that as a way of kind of shielding myself potentially from people who thought that my own naked ideas, as it were too weird, unsightly in some way that needed to be retooled. But as fate had it, like I had no opportunity to hide, and I had to kind of, Andre 3000 always says, Stevie Wonder had to step out from behind the piano from time to time. This idea that you have to kind of step outside of what it is that you think will protect you was the best thing that you can do, and just be you on the microphone on stage. And the reviews came back glowing. They were some of the best feedback I've ever received. They were like, no notes. It's a really weird book. It's a hard book. It's not affect theory. It's not film studies. It's not philosophy, but it's kind of all three. And I wouldn't change a word because it succeeds in being this weird kind of thing of its own. So I'm glad that, and it's circumstantial, that the circumstances under which I wrote it forced me to write it in a truthful way, a way that was riskier and more experimental, as opposed to something that would be safer and maybe easier to sell, as it were. And that just, I'm glad that circumstance and my own will kind of cohered in this way. But I think it's I would even say it's a good like message to end on, to not doubt. To not doubt yourself, to not be dissuaded, to still be courageous and still be persistent. In your pursuit, in your practice.
Exactly. And and then having a community to fall back on as well.
For sure.
Your writing friends, people who get it, other academics or other students, etc. And just have little rejection parties,
Yeah, like share, because you're not the only one going through it. And I think academia, it's one of these kind of truisms that rings all the more true the more you go through it, because by the time you get to a PhD, you're kind of wearing your room like Kevlar. It's like it's such a defensive posture, and it can be extremely isolating, but there is no reason that it should be.
Exactly.
So I would completely double that and say reach out, share, be empathetic, be kind, be rigorous, be persistent, be brave. I'll thank you one more time for joining me, Ines. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
Outstanding. This has been an episode of Literature Plus. We'll see you next time.